He put a notice in the county paper, 3 lines. Widower needs a cook, room and board, hard work, no nonsense. That's all it said. That's all he thought he needed. But I have cooked in a lot of kitchens in my life, and I have learned that a stove tells you the truth about a house before anyone opens their mouth. His stove was cold in the middle of the afternoon. His flour bin had gone to weevils, and there were 6 plates on the shelf, but only 5 of them had ever been washed since the last time somebody who loved this family set them down. He said he needed a cook. What he had was a house with 5 children in it who had forgotten how to be hungry, a girl of 8 who hadn't said a word in 2 years, and a man so afraid of one more loss that he'd learned to stop looking his own bobbies in the eye. I didn't come there to fix any of that. God knows I was too broken myself. I came because I had nowhere else to go and 40 cents to my name. But you don't measure a family in what the notice says. You measure it in what nobody will say out loud. So sit with me a while. This one takes some telling, and I promise you before the end, somebody in that house is going to speak who hadn't spoken in a long, long time. The first thing I did in that house was catch a falling child, and I want you to understand I nearly didn't. It was the smallest one, Sadie, 3 years old, all elbows and a nightgown gone gray at the hem, and she was up on the seat of a kitchen chair reaching for something on a high shelf when the chair went out from under her. I had been in that kitchen maybe 90 seconds. My carpetbag was still in my hand. I dropped it and got an arm across her, and we both went down together against the flour bin, and she looked up at me, not scared. That's the thing I remember, not scared at all, just startled. And then she reached up and patted my cheek twice with a flat little hand like she was checking to see if I was real. Nobody else came running. That's the second thing I remember. A 3-year-old fell off a chair with a crash you could have heard in the barn, and the house stayed quiet as a churchyard. I'd walked up from the road because the man who was supposed to meet me at the county seat hadn't come, and a freighter carrying nails and lamp oil had let me ride the last 9 miles for the price of listening to his opinions on the government. He'd pointed out the turnoff and said, "Rourke Place," and something in the way he said it made me look at him, but he only clucked to his mules and rolled on. The house sat low and long under a stand of live oaks, good bones, a real house, not a soddy or a dugout, which told me there'd once been money and care here. But the yard was a graveyard of chores nobody had finished. A wash left on the line so long the sun had rotted it stiff. A wagon with one wheel off and the wheel never put back. A milk cow standing at a dry trough, lowing at me like I might be the answer to a question she'd been asking all day. I knocked. No one answered, so I let myself in, and that's when Sadie fell. I sat her back up on the floor and she toddled off toward the front of the house without a sound, and I took my first real look at the room. And here is where I'll tell you what I do, the small foolish thing I've done all my life, so you'll understand me. I keep a book, an oilcloth ledger, small enough to fit an apron pocket, and in it I write down what people eat. I have done it for near 20 years. In a good kitchen, it's how I remember whose stomach can't take onions and who won't touch fish on a Friday. But it started ugly. It started the year I nursed my Thomas and then our baby through the same fever in the same 8 weeks, writing down every spoonful of broth either one of them could keep down, because when a person is dying the only power you have left is counting. 2 tablespoons, kept it. 1 tablespoon, lost it. I filled a whole book that autumn, and at the end of it I had a dead husband and a dead child, and a ledger that proved I had counted every mouthful right up to the end. So that's the woman who walked into Sela's Rourke's kitchen, not a saint, a widow with a counting habit and 40 cents. I stood in that cold kitchen, and I did what I always do when I don't know what else to do. I read the room the way you'd read a page. 6 plates on the shelf, blue-rimmed enamel, the good kind, but only 5 of them had the shine of regular washing. The 6th sat behind the others with a soft gray bloom of dust on it, the way a thing gets when a hand reaches past it every single day on purpose. Flour gone to weevils. A crock of sourdough starter shoved to the back of the counter, the top of it cracked and gray and long dead. And starter doesn't die easy. You have to work at killing it. You have to ignore it for weeks. A woman's apron on a peg by the stove, faded roses, folded once and hung. Not the way you hang a thing you use, but the way you hang a thing you're keeping. I didn't need anyone to tell me there'd been a wife. The whole kitchen was telling me, in the only voice a kitchen has. That's when the girl came in. She was 15 or near it, tall for it, with her father's dark hair scraped back so hard it must have hurt. And she had the baby, Sadie, on her hip now, and a look on her face I have seen on soldiers. She stopped in the doorway and she looked at my bag on the floor and my hand where it had smudged the flour dust, and she said, flat as a table, "You the cook?" Not a question. I said I supposed I was if this was the Rourke place, and that Mr. Rourke had answered my letter. Pa's in the south pasture. She hitched the baby higher. He didn't tell us you were coming today. He didn't tell me anyone would be here to tell, I said, gentle as I could, or I'd have brought a peppermint stick or two. Something flickered across her face and got shut down fast. We don't need managing, she said. I manage fine. And oh, she did. That was the terrible thing. I could see it all over her. The girl was 15 and she was running a house with 5 children in it and cattle in the field and a father somewhere out in the grass. And she was doing it the way you carry water in a cracked bucket, fast, fast, before it all runs out. And she had been doing it so long she'd forgotten there was any other way to walk. Her hands, when she set the baby down, were a woman's hands, chapped and split at the knuckle. She was a child with a woman's hands, and I wanted to sit down on the floor and cry, but that's not what you do. Not to a girl like that. A girl like that, you'd shame her half to death with your pity. So I said, "What's your name?" "Cora." "Cora, I'm not here to manage you. I'm here to cook and to spell you where I can, because a person can't do everything and shouldn't have to try." I picked up my bag. "Now, when did these children last eat something hot?" She didn't answer that, and a non-answer is an answer. I found the others one at a time, like finding stones in a field. There was Wade, 12, out behind the barn throwing a knife at a fence post, over and over, thunk, 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 with a fury that had nothing to do with the knife and everything to do with something he had no name for. He looked at me once hard and went back to throwing, and when I said his supper would be ready by dark, he said, "I already ate," which was a lie, and we both knew it, and I let him keep it because sometimes a lie is a boy's only fence. There was Jesse, 6, who attached himself to my skirts within the hour and would not be pried off, following me from stove to pump to woodpile with his thumb near his mouth, watching everything I did with a starved kind of attention, as if I might vanish the moment he blinked. There was Sadie, the baby who I've told you about, who patted faces. And there was Pearl. I want to take my time with Pearl. I found her last in the second bedroom, sitting on the floor in a square of windowlight with a rag doll in her lap and her back to the wall, and she was 8 years old, and she watched me come in with the enormous still eyes of a fawn that has decided the safest thing is not to move at all. I said hello. I said my name. I told her I liked her doll. She watched me and did not answer, and I thought, shy, all right, a shy one, and I crouched down slow the way you would with a strange dog, and I asked her the doll's name. Nothing, just the watching. It was Cora from the doorway who said it fast and hard to get it over with. Pearl doesn't talk. She hasn't talked since Ma died, 2 years, a beat. Don't make a thing of it. It makes her worse when people make a thing of it. So I didn't make a thing of it. I looked at Pearl and I said, "That's a fine doll, and I'd be glad of your help in the kitchen if you feel like it, and if you don't, that's all right too." And I stood up and went back to the stove, and I did not look back to see if she followed. Because I have learned that some creatures will only come to you if you stop needing them to. She followed. About 20 minutes later, stood in the kitchen doorway with the doll and watched me build a fire in a stove that hadn't seen one in, I'd guess, a good many days. Now here is what I found when I went to make those children a supper, and I put it in my ledger that first night so I'd remember it, and I'll tell it to you plain because it's the heart of what was wrong in that house. There was food. That's the thing. This was not a poor family. There was a smokehouse with a side of bacon and 2 hams. There was a root cellar with potatoes and onions and a bin of last year's dried apples. There was a milk cow if somebody would only milk her, and hens if somebody would only find where they'd taken to laying. There was cornmeal, and there was, under the weevily flour in a tin, good flour, kept sound. There was everything a woman needs to feed a family well. And nobody was cooking any of it. They'd been living on what a 15-year-old could throw together between 40 other chores. Cold biscuit, bacon burnt or bacon raw, beans that had been on so long they'd gone to paste, or beans that were still hard because she'd run out of daylight to tend them. Coffee, endless coffee, because coffee is what you make when you are too tired to make food. I opened a pot on the back of the stove and it was beans, 3 days old and going. It wasn't want. It was grief. Grief had walked into that kitchen 2 years ago and put the fire out, and it had never once let it be relit, because the woman who tended that fire was gone, and to cook in her kitchen was to stand where she'd stood, and none of them could bear it. Not the girl, not the man. So I lit the fire, and I made them cornbread, and I fried bacon proper, crisp and drained, and I opened the dried apples and stewed them soft with a little of the good flour to thicken and what sugar I could find, and I made a milk gravy, and I set the table with 5 of the 6 blue plates. They came to the smell. That's a true thing about hungry children, and it will break your heart if you let it. They will fight you and lie to you and tell you they already ate, and then the smell of hot cornbread will walk right past all of that and pull them to the table like a hand on the collar. Wade came in last and sat down glaring at his plate like it had insulted him, and then he ate 3 pieces of cornbread so fast I had to look away so I wouldn't shame him. Jessie ate with one hand fisted in my skirt. Sadie ate with her fingers and got apple in her hair. Pearl ate, silent, small bites, watching me the whole time over the rim of the blue plate. Cora ate last and least because she was still up, still moving, still filling the cracked bucket, cutting Sadie's food and wiping Jessie's chin and half out of her own chair the entire meal, and I thought, that one hasn't sat down to a meal in 2 years either. That one eats standing up. That one has forgotten she is also a child. And that is the meal Silas Rourke walked in on. I heard him before I saw him. Boots on the porch, the particular heavy tread of a big tired man, and then the door and the smell of horse and dust and outside came in with him. He was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders and gone lean everywhere else the way a man goes when he's stopped tending himself. Dark hair, dark stubble, and eyes that had the specific deadness of a person who has taught himself not to feel things because feeling things had nearly killed him once. He stopped in the doorway. He took in the table, the lit stove, the hot food, the 5 plates, the woman he didn't know standing at his wife's stove in his wife's kitchen with his children eating around her, and I watched something move across that man's face that I have never forgotten and never will. It wasn't relief. I'd have bet on relief. It wasn't even anger, though there was some of that. It was fear. Pure animal fear, there and gone. The fear of a man who has arranged his entire life around not feeling something, and has just walked in to find a stranger has lit the exact fire he's been keeping out. "You're the Cole woman," he said. "Winifred Cole, Winnie. You came today. Your letter said the 15th. This is the 15th. He looked at the table again. His jaw worked. And then he did a thing I did not expect and would spend weeks trying to understand. He did not sit down. There was a 6th plate. I had not said it, and I understood now why. I understood the dusty plate on the shelf, but I had left room at the table, the head of the table, and Silas Rourke looked at that empty place at the head of his own table where a man sits down to eat with his children, and he could not do it. "I'll eat later," he said. "In the barn I've got a sick heifer," and to Cora sharp, "You didn't tell me she'd started already." "She just—" "It's fine." He was already turning. He got his hand on the door, And then he stopped, and without turning around, in a voice I had to strain to hear, he said, "It smells like," and he didn't finish it. He just stood there a second with his back to us and his hand on the door and his head down, and then he went out into the dark, and the door shut soft behind him. "It smells like she used to." That's what he couldn't say. I knew it the way you know weather. Cora was looking at me now with something new in her face, and it took me a moment to place it because it was so unexpected on a 15-year-old. And then I had it. It was pity. She pitied me. She'd seen her father's back go out that door, and she was looking at me the way you look at someone who's bought a horse that's going to throw them. "He won't sit at the table," she said quietly, while the little ones ate. "Not since we eat, he eats after in the barn or standing at the counter. 2 years. She wiped Sadie's mouth. "You'll want to know that, in case you thought," she stopped. "In case you thought you'd fix something, you didn't fix anything. You just made supper." And that, I'll be honest with you, that was the moment I nearly left. Not because she was cruel. She wasn't being cruel. She was being kind, in the only way that broken girl knew how, which was to warn me off before I got my heart involved in a house where hearts went to die. I stood there at that stove with my 40 cents and my dead husband and my dead baby and my counting habit, and I thought, "Winnie, you fool, you came here to cook for money because you had nowhere else to go. And this is not a kitchen. This is a grave with a stove in it, and you have already buried everyone you were ever going to bury, and you cannot do it again. You do not have another burying in you." I thought all that. I want you to know I thought it, so you'll know that what I did next wasn't strength. I've never trusted a story where the woman is simply strong. Strength is a thing they put on us afterward in the telling to make it tidy. There was nothing tidy about that night. What happened was Pearl. While I stood there deciding to leave, the silent one, the 8-year-old who hadn't said a word in 2 years, got down from her chair. And she came around the table with her empty blue plate held out in both hands, the way you'd carry something precious, and she stood in front of me and she held it up. And she looked at me with those enormous fawn eyes, and she couldn't say it. She had no words to say it with. But a child holding up an empty plate to a cook is saying one thing, and one thing only in every language there ever was. "More, please." I took the plate. My hand wasn't as steady as I'd have liked, and I put more cornbread on it and more apples, and I gave it back to her, and she carried it back to her chair like it was full of gold, and she sat back down and ate, and she never said a word, and I stood at that stove and I unmade every plan I'd made to leave, because you cannot walk out on a child who has just, after 2 years, worked up the courage to ask you for something. I got out my ledger that night by candlelight in the little room off the kitchen they'd given me, and I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled of dust, and I wrote the date, and under it I wrote what each of them had eaten, the way I've done for 20 years. Cora, hardly anything. Wade, 3 cornbread, 1 bacon, 8 angry. Jessie, everything, 8 holding my skirt. Sadie, apples, wore some. Sela's, nothing, would not sit. And then Pearl. And beside Pearl's name I did something I'd never done in 20 years of keeping that book. I didn't write the food. I wrote "asked for more." 2 words. And I sat there and looked at them a long time in the candlelight, those 2 small words, because they were the first hopeful thing I'd written in a ledger since before the fever. And I understood, sitting there, that I was not going to be able to do the smart thing. I was not going to be able to cook their food and keep my heart. I was going to fall in love with these 5 broken children whether it killed me or not, and it might well kill me, and there was not one thing I could do about it. Out in the barn, a lantern was burning. I could see the yellow of it through my little window, low and steady, and I knew the man was out there sitting with a sick heifer he probably could have left till morning, sitting out there in the cold and the dark rather than come into a warm house that smelled like his wife. And I thought about the 6th plate with the dust on it, and I understood that whatever healing was going to happen in that house, if any happened at all, the hardest heart in it to reach wasn't going to be any of the children's. It was going to be his. I blew out the candle, but I left my door open a crack So if any of them woke in the night and came looking, they'd see there was a light. No, there was no light. I'd blown it out. What I mean is I left it open so they'd know the door wasn't a wall. I lay in the dark a long time listening to that house breathe. 5 children, 1 man, and out past the wall of the pasture, under a sky I couldn't see, a whole lot of nothing between us and anywhere else. The lantern in the barn stayed lit till near dawn. I know because I was awake to see it go out. The war between me and Cora Rourke lasted 11 days, and I lost every battle of it, and I have never been so glad to lose anything in my life. It didn't look like a war. That's the thing about a girl like Cora. She'd been raised polite, and grief had made her polite the way ice makes a road hard. So there was never a raised voice, never a slammed door. There was just 100 small ways every day that she let me know this was her house, her kitchen, her children, and I was hired help who'd be moving on. She'd redo things. I'd set the bread to rise and come back and find she'd punched it down, because Ma always let it go twice. She'd take the little ones off to bed herself fast before I could offer, and I'd hear her in there in the dark doing the whole ritual her mother must have taught her, the washing and the prayers, guarding it, keeping it exactly, because to let me do it would be to admit her mother's way could be done by other hands. I understood her. Lord, I understood her. She was doing what I'd done with my ledger. She was counting. She'd taken the whole weight of that dead woman's household onto her 15-year-old back because as long as she carried it perfectly, her mother wasn't all the way gone. To set it down, even for an hour, even to let a kind stranger fry the bacon, was to feel how heavy it truly was, and to feel that was to feel it all. So I didn't fight her for it. I let her win. I found the corners of that house she'd let go because you cannot do everything. No 15-year-old can, and there were corners, and I worked those. The mending pile that had grown to the size of a haystack. The garden gone to weed that I got Wade to help me turn, though it took me 4 days to get him to it. And I did it by the low trick of never once asking him, and only saying, out loud to no one, that I sure did wish I knew a strong body who could break that hard ground, and letting a 12-year-old boy's pride do the rest. That's how I got Wade in the end, not with kindness. Wade had walls against kindness. Kindness was the thing that had been coming at him for 2 years from pitying neighbors, and it made him snarl. What Wade had no wall against was being needed. I gave that boy jobs, hard ones, real ones. I told him the pump was above me and could he see to it. And I told him I couldn't reach the smokehouse hooks and would he cut me down a ham. And I let him carry the heavy things and fix the broken things. And slow, over those 11 days, the boy who threw a knife at a fence post out of a rage he had no name for started to have somewhere to put his hands. The rage, I came to understand, was guilt. It usually is in a boy. Wade had been 10 when his mother died, old enough to remember being told to be a big boy and help, old enough to have failed at a thing no 10-year-old could ever have done, which was save her, and he'd been carrying that failure around ever since, disguised as anger, because anger is the only feeling a boy that age is allowed. I never said a word about any of it. You don't. You just give the boy a ham to cut down and you tell him he did it well, and you let a true thing, you are useful. You are wanted. You did not fail, soak in through his hands where he'd never let it in through his ears. Jesse I didn't have to work at. Jesse had decided I was his the first afternoon and never revisited the question. He was 6 and he'd been 6 going on invisible, the middle child, too big to be bobbied like Sadie and too small to be useful like Wade, and no one had had a spare hand for him in 2 years. So I gave him mine. Literally, I let the child hold my hand, my skirt, my apron string, whatever he could reach all day long, and I talked to him while I worked. A running low stream of nothing, the flour and the weather, and where do you suppose that hen's been laying? And Jesse drank it like a plant drinks rain and started within a week to talk back. He had a stammer when he was excited. Had the time to notice. I noticed. I slowed down when he talked so he'd never feel hurried, and the stammer eased. Sadie was 3 and Sadie was fine, or as fine as a child can be who never knew the mother everyone else was grieving, which is its own particular kind of orphan that no one thinks about. Sadie's grief was going to come later, I knew, when she was old enough to understand she'd cost something by being born, because that's what had happened. I'd pieced it together by then. Mercy Rourke had died having Sadie. The birth had gone wrong and the doctor was 2 days away and she'd bled, and Silas had held her while she went, and the baby that lived was the baby that took her, and every soul in that house loved Sadie, and not one of them could look at her without the arithmetic. I'd seen Silas do it. Watch Sadie toddle across a room with a look on his face like a wound reopening. And Pearl. Pearl was the one I could not reach, and Pearl was the one I could not stop trying to reach. And by the end of the 11 days, I understood that Pearl was the whole knot of it. The others grieved out loud in their ways, Wade's rage, Cora's carrying, Jessie's clinging. Pearl had grieved by going silent, and she'd gone silent at 6, and now she was 8, and 2 years of a child's life is a long time to spend inside your own head with no way out. She wasn't simple. I want to be clear on that because folks are quick to think it of a child who won't talk, and it made me furious on her behalf. Pearl was sharp as a tack. Her eyes followed everything. She understood every word said to her and every word said around her, which was worse, because grown people are careless around a child who can't repeat what they hear, and I'd have bet that girl had heard things in 2 years that no one meant her to hear. She could write a little. She could point. She had ways. She simply could not speak, and the doctor in town had told Silas it was grief and it would pass, and it hadn't passed, and somewhere in there Silas had stopped believing it would, and a father who has stopped believing his child will heal is a father who has started, without meaning to grieve that child too, while she's still alive. I'd caught him doing it, looking at Pearl the way you look at a photograph. Here's how I got to Pearl. It wasn't clever, it was the ledger. She'd taken to being in the kitchen with me. Silent, always in the corner with the rag doll, but there, watching me cook the way some children watch a fire. And one afternoon I was writing in my book. I'd fallen back to writing what they ate, the old habit, and I felt her come and stand at my elbow and look at the page. And she couldn't ask what it was, but she could look. So I told her. "It's my book," I said, not stopping writing, keeping it easy. "I write down what everybody eats. See, that's you, that's Pearl, and yesterday you ate 2 biscuits and you didn't care for the turnips, which I noticed, so I'm writing here, Pearl, no turnips, so I'll remember not to waste them on you." I turned the page so she could see her own name in my hand, several days of it. "You're all in here. I keep everybody." She looked at that page a long, long time, her name, written down, kept. And then she held out her hand for the pencil. I gave it to her. I did not make a thing of it. Cora had told me not to make a thing of things, and it was the truest advice I got in that house. I just gave her the pencil and went on stirring my pot with my back half turned so she'd have privacy, and when I looked again she'd written. In the round, careful hand of a child, under her own name, one word. Apples. Misspelled, apples. She was telling me what she wanted. She was telling me the way I'd shown her, in the book, in writing, because I'd made a place where a thing could be asked for without a voice. I made her apples, and that night in my ledger I wrote under Pearl, wrote to me, wants apples, gave pencil back but she kept it. She kept the pencil. She took it to bed. And after that Pearl and I wrote. Not much, not fast. A word here, a word there in the margins of my food book. This silent conversation running alongside the meals, and it was the closest thing to talking that child had done in 2 years, and I guarded it like Cora guarded the bedtime prayers, fierce and quiet, and I told no one, because it was hers. Now I have to tell you about the setback, because there's always a setback, and this one nearly ended everything. It was the 12th day, and it started, of all the fool things, with a pie. I'd found in the root cellar a crock of preserved cherries, home-canned, careful work, and there were 7 jars of them, and they were 2 years old, which meant Mercy Rourke had put them up. Her last summer. Her hands had washed those cherries and packed those jars. And God forgive me, I didn't think it through. I saw 7 jars of cherries and a family that needed feeding, and I made a pie. Silas came in from the field and smelled it. And this time it wasn't the fear and flee of that first night. This time the deadness cracked, and what was under the deadness came out, and it was rage. The same rage I'd been so carefully draining out of Wade, except this was a grown man's and it had had 2 years to distill. "Where did you get those cherries? Lo, terrible." I told him, the cellar. Those were hers. He was very still, which was worse than shouting. "She put those up, that was the last," his voice did something. "Those were the last things her hands ever, and you baked them, you used them up for a pie." He said the word pie like it was filth. "In an afternoon, 2 years she and you just," he couldn't finish anything. His hands were shaking. "Who told you you could touch her things? Who are you? You've been in this house 12 days and the aprons moved, the plates, you've got them all, Cora barely, you're replacing her. You think you can walk in here and cook and stir the pot and be Sela's. You're not her." His eyes were wet and furious and lost. "You'll never be her, and I won't have my children thinking, I won't have Sadie growing up calling some hired." He stopped himself before the worst of it, just barely. But it was out, most of it. The thing he was really afraid of, which was not that I'd baked a pie but that I'd stay, and that his children would love me, and that in loving me they'd let go of the last edges of the woman they were all clinging to. And then she'd truly be gone, and he could not bear for her to be gone, because as long as everyone kept grieving her hard enough she was still, in a way, in the house. The children had gone silent, all of them. Wade in the doorway with his fists, Cora with the baby, white-faced, Jessie hiding in my skirts, and Pearl in her corner watching her father come apart, her enormous eyes going from him to me and back. And I want to tell you I said something wise. I didn't. I stood there in front of a grieving man's rage with a cherry pie cooling on the sill between us, and I felt the whole thing I'd feared that first night come true, that I'd let these children into my heart, and now it was going to be torn out again. And I heard myself say, quiet, the only true thing I had. "I lost a husband and a baby in the same 8 weeks, Mr. Rourke, 2 years ago this fall. I know exactly whose hands those cherries were, and I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I'll leave in the morning." That stopped him. He hadn't known. Nobody'd told him, why would they? I was the cook. And he stood there with his rage running out of him like water out of a cracked bucket, looking at me new. And into that silence, into that terrible quiet where a grown man and a grown woman stood in the wreck of their 2 griefs with 5 frightened children watching. Pearl stood up. She crossed the kitchen. She had a piece of my ledger paper in her hand, torn from the back, and her pencil, and she'd written on it while we fought. And she walked up to her father and she pulled at his sleeve until he looked down, and she gave him the paper. And I watched Silas Rourke read what his silent daughter had written, and I watched his face change. And then he made a sound I'd never heard a man make, a sound like something breaking that had been holding up a roof, and he went down on his knees on the kitchen floor and pulled that child against him and held her. I didn't see the paper till later. Pearl showed me. In a child's round hand, misspelled, it said, "Don't make her go, she writes me down. I want to be written down. I want to be written down." 2 years of silence, and the first thing that girl fought her way out of it for was to keep from being uncounted again. I did not leave in the morning. But I'll tell you what I've never told anyone, because you've stayed with me this long and you deserve the truth of it. That night, after the house went quiet, after Silas had gone to the barn like always, I took the cherry pie, the whole pie, untouched, none of us could eat it, and I carried it out to him in the dark. And I set it down on the workbench beside his lantern. And I didn't say a word about her being gone or him healing or any of the things a fool says. I just said, she'd have wanted somebody to eat these, Silas. She didn't put up 7 jars of cherries to have them sit in a cellar. She put them up to feed people she loved. That's the only reason anybody puts up cherries. And I left him out there with the pie and the lantern. In the morning the pie plate was on the kitchen counter, empty, washed, and set beside it, out from behind the others where it had gathered dust for 2 years, was the 6th blue plate. He'd taken it down himself. He didn't say anything about it, Neither did I. But it was down. The blizzard came in the third week of my second month, and it came the way the bad ones always come out on that flat land, not with warning but with a green sky at noon and a smell like iron, and then a wind that took the temperature down 40 degrees in the space of an hour, and packed the air so full of snow you couldn't see the barn from the house. Silas was in it. He'd ridden out at dawn to move cattle to the low draw where they'd have shelter, him and no one, because that's how a man does it who's used to doing everything alone. And the storm that the almanac said was 3 days off came in before noon, and by 2 o'clock the world was white and screaming, and Silas Rourke was somewhere out in it, and he had not come back. I want to tell you about that afternoon because it's where the story turns, and it turns not on Silas at all. It turns on the children, on all 5 of them, because a family, if it's ever going to be a family again, has to be tested as one, and grief had taught these 5 to grieve alone, each in their separate room of the same dark house, and the storm is what finally drove them into one room. It was Cora who kept her head, which won't surprise you, and Cora who nearly killed herself trying to go out after him, which won't either. I caught her at the door with her mother's shawl already on and a lantern in her hand, 15 years old and about to walk into a blizzard to find her father, and I got both arms around her and I held on while she fought me, and she was strong, grief strong, and she got us halfway out onto the porch before I could turn her, and the cold out there was like walking into a wall, and I got her back in and got the door shut, and I held that girl while she came apart at last, 2 years of it, in my arms in the front room, and I let her. And it was the first time she'd cried since her mother died, and the first time in 2 years she'd let another soul hold the bucket. I can't lose him too, over and over. I can't. I can't be the one who, if I'd made him take Wade, if I run this house, it's mine too, I can't lose him too. You're not going to lose him. I had no earthly right to say it. I said it anyway. And here's what the little ones did while their sister broke. Wade lit every lamp in the house and put them in the windows. Every one. He went from room to room, the boy with the rage in his hands, and he found a use for those hands. He made the house a beacon, all its windows blazing, so that a man lost in the white might see it and steer for it. And he didn't ask anybody. He just did it. And when I understood what he was doing, I could have wept, because it was the most useful thing in the world and he'd thought of it himself. Jesse, who was 6 and terrified, did the one thing a terrified 6-year-old could do that mattered. He took care of Sadie. He gathered up the baby and took her to the warmest corner by the stove, and he told her stories, in his little stammer, to keep her from crying. And he did it because Cora had always done it for him, and now Cora was the one crying. And Jesse, who'd been invisible his whole life, made himself the one who watched the baby. And he was so proud and so scared and so exactly the right size for that one job. And Pearl went to the stove, and she started to cook. 8 years old, silent as ever, and she pulled a chair to the stove, and she got out the coffee and the beans, and she started making the one thing she'd watched me make 100 times, because a person coming in out of a storm half dead needs something hot, and Pearl had understood that. Pearl had understood it the way I'd understood a cold stove that first day. The house had to be ready to receive him, warm and lit and smelling of food. Ready to pull him in from the cold the way the smell of cornbread had pulled these children to the table. And she built it, that silent girl, she built the welcome with her own hands. I helped her, I let her lead it, it was hers. And we waited, the 5 of us and the storm. Lamps in every window, coffee on the stove, the baby telling story to sleep, Cora wrung out and quiet against my side, and the wind screaming, and the dark coming down early the way it does in a storm, and no Silas. He came at the last edge of the light. We heard the horse first, a scream from the horse, out by the barn, and Wade was out the door before I could stop him, and I went after him. And there in the swirling near dark was Silas's horse, riderless, and Silas about 30 feet behind it, on foot, on his hands and knees in the snow, near the end of himself. He'd lost the horse, or the horse had lost him, and he'd been walking, crawling, the last of it toward the only thing he could see, which was a house with every window blazing gold. And Wade and I got him up between us and got him in, and he was so cold he couldn't talk, couldn't hardly stand, ice in his beard and his hands gone white and wooden. And we got him down by the stove, and I did the things you do, the wet things off him, the blankets on, the warmth slow so his heart wouldn't stop from it. The whole time Cora with her hands over her mouth, and Jessie crying, and Sadie waking and reaching for her pa. And Pearl put a cup of hot coffee in her father's shaking hands. That's when it happened. I want to slow it all the way down because it's the whole reason I've told you any of this. Silas took the coffee in his frozen hands and he looked up, dazed, at the ring of his children's faces. And he saw the lamps in every window that had brought him home. And he understood. You could see him understand that his bobbies had done this, that the beacon and the warmth and the coffee in his hands had all been made by these 5 children he'd spent 2 years being too afraid to love. And he opened his mouth to say something and nothing came out. He was too far gone and too undone. And into that silence Pearl spoke. 2 years, not one word in 2 years. She looked at her father with the coffee shaking in his hands, and she said, in a small rusty voice like a door that hasn't opened in a long time, "Drink it, Pa, I made it warm." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Cora's hand came off her mouth. Wade went white. And Silas Rourke looked at his silent daughter who had just after 2 years spoken to him, spoken to save him. And the last thing in that man that had been frozen since the day his wife died broke apart. And he set the coffee down with hands that were shaking now for a different reason. And he gathered that child in. And then he was reaching for all of them, all 5, pulling them in. Cora and Wade and Jessie and the baby and Pearl, all of them, the whole broken armful of them. And he held on the way a drowning man holds on, and he wept and they wept. And I stood back by the stove where a cook belongs, and I let that family have the thing they'd been unable to have for 2 years, which was each other, all at once in one room holding on. I'd like to tell you Pearl talked normal after that, easy, like a spring unstoppered. She didn't. It came back slow, over months, a word and then a sentence and then, one ordinary morning, a whole complaint about her brother that was so gloriously 9 years old normal that Cora laughed out loud and then clapped her own hand over her mouth in shock at the sound of her own laugh. It came back the way the thaw comes to that country, not all at once, but you turn around one day and the ice is gone and you can't say exactly when. Silas started sitting at the table. Not that night. It was near a week later, an ordinary supper, and I'd set the 6 blue plates like I'd taken to doing, the 6th one always there now, always waiting, and I never said a word about it and neither did he. And that night he came in from the field and he washed his hands and he stood behind the empty chair at the head of his table a long moment, and then he pulled it out, and he sat down, and he ate supper with his children for the first time in 2 years, and nobody made a thing of it. Because I'd taught them not to make a thing of things, and making no thing of it was the greatest gift we could give him. But under the table, where I don't think he knew I could see, Cora reached over and put her hand on her father's knee, just for a second, just to know he was there. And he put his big hand over her small chapped one, the hand of a girl who'd carried a household on her back since she was 13, and he held it, and I got up to get the cornbread so they wouldn't see me have to turn away. I'm still here, in case you're wondering. It's been 3 years now. I never became Mercy Rourke, and I never tried to. That was Silas's fear, and it never came true. Nobody replaced her. Her plate came down off the shelf. She came into the house again. We talk about her now, the children and I. We say her name at the table, which we couldn't do for 2 years. And Sadie is 6 now and knows exactly whose cherries those were, and helps me put up new ones every summer in her mother's jars. And that arithmetic that used to reopen like a wound when Silas looked at her, it healed. It healed because we said it out loud. A grief you can name at the supper table is a grief that stopped killing you. What Silas and I are to each other now is a longer story and not entirely mine to tell, And I'll only say that a man and a woman who have each buried the person they loved most don't fall in love the way the young do, fast and sure. They come to it sideways, slow, over a lot of ordinary suppers, and there's no fireworks in it, and it's the realest thing I've ever known. He's never once told me he loves me. He shows me. He took down a plate. He sat at a table. For a man like Silas, that's the whole poem. I keep the ledger still, but it's changed. It's not what people eat anymore, not mostly. Somewhere in that first winter it turned into something else, and now it's just the days. What Wade fixed, what Jesse said, what made Cora laugh. The first spring word Pearl spoke, and the 10th and the 100th. I write them down because I learned something the hard way, twice now, in two different griefs, that the ones you love can be taken so fast, and all you're left with is what you manage to keep. And I mean to keep every last thing about these six that I possibly can, every ordinary golden day of it, written down, kept, so that whatever comes, no one in this house is ever again.